Cool. So yeah, so as kind of said in the introduction, I'm going to give a bit of an introduction to, what your data might tell you, what you can do with it. Initially, I'm going to start with a very brief kind of introduction on my background, where my experience with kind of data comes from. Then we'll have a bit of look at a monitoring framework, talk a little bit about that and some of the sort of principles and best practice of both data interpretation and kind of visualization elements before we actually go into looking at some different ways of interpreting and also visualizing data. So yeah, as I say, I'll start off with a very brief kind of intro to myself. So I'm a river engagement officer with Severn Rivers Trust. I am by no means a data expert, so I'll get that in early. I have spent the last 3 years working on the Casco project. So for those not familiar with that, that is the Catchment Systems Thinking Cooperative project. It was a national project, but we were involved with the team demonstrator and the team catchment. So a lot of what I'm kind of going to run through will be learnings and examples that have come from that project in particular, and also some of the other, there was 9 demonstration catchments as part of that, so it'll be kind of pulling some bits in from those as well. If you're not familiar with this project, it was essentially kind of trying to close the gap between people, data, and then the decisions that affect rivers. And the ethos was for it to have strong, robust data that could then lead to kind of meaningful impact. So as part of this, there was a lot of kind of data interpretation and kind of visualization requirements as part of it, which is sort of why we were able to pull bits together to do this presentation today. So for this project, there were sort of 5 key principles, and data kind of aligns through them all. The first was for it to be kind of collaborative. So investing in the kind of outcomes using the data, bringing whole kind of different groups together. It was done partnerships right within each of the demonstration catchments. For the data to be impactful, so making sure that that data that was collected had a clear purpose and outcome. For it to be open data, so the idea is that kind of all the data is openly accessible and open by default. There was also a big emphasis on the data being kind of rigorous. So we looked at different best practices for actually collecting and also sharing data beyond that. And to have kind of a future-minded element to it as well. So developing tools that can drive impact, but can kind of also be tailored for developments in the future. And I should say as well that all of my experience around this particular project and data has been along the lines of chemical water quality monitoring with a little bit of bacteria monitoring. So all of the kind of examples I'm going to use will be kind of tailored around that. You may well kind of monitor other things, invertebrates and the likes, outfall monitoring, and which the principles can kind of remain the same, but that'll be why the examples that I'll give will be very much tailored along the chemical monitoring. So I mentioned a little bit about this kind of monitoring framework. So essentially, this is the kind of for meaningful data to come out of it, it needs to have a really well thought out monitoring strategy. And this is essentially meaning that you need to consider how you might interpret and present that data right at the start. So not just getting to the end and then trying to work it out. So I'm not suggesting that we should try and second guess data or manipulate it to tell a particular story, but you need to have an idea of the direction of travel right at the start. So there's, like I said, there's no point trying to determine how healthy a river is at the end if you haven't collected that right data to help inform that question. So as a sort of starting point, developing a monitoring plan that clearly outlines the purpose of the monitoring and determining the sort of the why, the what, the how, the when, the where is really key, because that then determines what elements you do of data collection, so actually generating that data that you'll then go on to interpret. So that kind of is really much pinned around that monitoring plan. And then obviously once you've done that data collection, it's making sure that you've got that right data to then go on to look to interpret those results. So determining what the story is, what those key trends might be, before then obviously working out how you can relay that story to others. So presenting the findings that you've got from that. So although it's just, it's a very simplified way of looking at it, just in 4 steps, is the kind of emphasis is around making sure that this interpretation of data is considered right at the start and not just an afterthought at the end. And there are some sort of principles and sort of best practice that can be applied to these. Ultimately, they are driven by the kind of purpose of the monitoring, who the monitoring's for, and when it's going to be used. So that'll ultimately tailor any work that you do with the data. But these 6 kind of best practices are something that you should kind of keep in the back of your head, really, when you're kind of then looking at it. So where possible, you want to avoid using acronyms or sort of technical jargon. Make sure that anything that you do with data is kind of appropriate for the identified audience. If you do have to use acronyms, they're not always avoidable. Just make sure that they're kind of spelled out or put in the relevant context. Where again, where possible, you show your thresholds and wider context. So identifying if a kind of a value is good or borderline or poor is a lot easier for somebody to understand than just having raw data. And we'll talk a little bit in a few slides time about kind of thresholds and how you can kind of make them visible alongside any data that you do have. Again, that'll kind of, be linked back to your purpose of what your monitoring parameters are. Be honest about any uncertainty. So you can add ranges into any data presentation that you do, adding confidence bands or indicating where perhaps detections are lower than the limit. So, for example, when we're doing the bacteria monitoring for the teamwork, there were occasions where the levels that we detected were just kind of below that would be picked up. So obviously we had to show that. You want to try and sort of favour comparisons over raw numbers. So this is mainly in relation to the kind of the visualization element, where you've kind of got the ability to kind of show trends or like percentage changes. That's a lot easier for people to interpret than just having, again, like raw data and just decimals there, where they can visibly see that change is easier to be interpreted. And don't overpromise precision. So you want to try and avoid kind of implying a precision greater than the method supports. So most equipment has really well clearly defined error ranges. So you can include that within any analysis that you do. And ultimately, you want to try and minimize cognitive load. So you'll see again in a few slides time, I've got some examples in there where you're trying to kind of present and put your points across, try and communicate one sort of element at a time. You'll see that where you try and do multiple things together, it quite quickly becomes a bit of an overload. And that's when people are just likely to kind of switch off and not really dig down to what the data is actually telling them. So in terms of data interpretation, so this is essentially looking at raw data that's been collected and then determining what it's telling you. So that kind of story element. And how you interpret this data will ultimately depend on the type of data that's been collected. But some of it, and particularly relating to the sort of identifying the scope element, will have been determined by your monitoring plan. So again, this is where it kind of links back to that plan and how vital it is, really. So if you were looking at individual sites or catchment scale, for example, that will already have been should have already been determined in your kind of plan and the direction of travel, so that you won't necessarily have to decide that at this point. But what perhaps might not have been necessarily considered at that stage, but you do need to consider when you're looking at how you can interpret your data, is the kind of time frame that you're looking at, and also the minimum amount of data points that you want to be included in any analysis. So this could, for example, be you might want to look over the last 12 months if you're doing working over that time frame, or you might be wanting to compare over the last 2 years, 10 years, for example. And even if you're then going on to kind of do year-on-year comparisons, again, having that kind of defined time frame is really key. And then in terms of the sort of minimum number of samples for inclusion, that will be the amount of data that you essentially include in each analysis. So for example, for us, when we're doing any analysis on the team data, we're looking for sites that have got at least 12 months worth of data, because we're looking at that like annual perception. And we look for we take a minimum of 12 sample points or sample sessions within that time frame. So ideally they would be split monthly, so one sample taken each month. And that for us is ultimately been defined by trying to identify the baseline, which kind of goes on to your kind of next element. So determining what is normal or what is to be expected for a particular site. Unless you've got that kind of coverage over that time frame, it's really hard to identify that. And this also helps to pick up any seasonal variation, which can then ultimately lead on to identifying any abnormal readings. So for us, we have identified over looking at several data sets for different sites that we generally get an increase in nutrient level over the summer months from around sort of May to September, start of October time. They then drop off, and then over winter we get the kind of spikes, and that's obviously due to increased concentrations of nutrients over that time. And then obviously winter months, the spikes are generally related to kind of rainfall events and kind of higher increases in runoff and things like that. But without us having that kind of defining that time frame and the number of samples, we wouldn't have been able to necessarily pick up those trends. And that's where it can be really hard to do kind of a greater detail of interpretation on an individual isolated result. So a lot of people might say, oh, you just sample at one site, have that data. What does that particular reading mean? Or when volunteers start with us, they're really keen, they go out, they do the first sample session and they're like, right, I've got my first sort of data. What does it tell me? And actually for us, we say, well, not a lot. We as a trust don't determine a lot from an individual sample point. That's where we're looking at the kind of longer term trends and kind of building that up, because you don't know whether that individual reading is normal for that site until you've kind of done that that longer term monitoring. Guess that does come with a slight caveat there of that baseline for that site might not be the perfect baseline, because that will still potentially be with inputs into a system, but it's the kind of the best baseline you're going to get, and then obviously it allows you to track changes over time if you go on to do year-on-year comparison. Which, yeah, once you've kind of got that baseline, then you've got this opportunity for doing kind of annual averages. But then you can kind of interrogate further down again to kind of track changes down a river or within a catchment. And this can be really good for identifying hotspots or where you've got kind of potential opportunities for further investigation. So it might be that it, identifies areas that you can then kind of develop an adaptive monitoring plan to kind of reassess where you actually sample. So even once you kind of cleanse data and kind of split it out into its raw form, it can still be quite hard to determine what it's actually telling you in terms of whether it's a good or bad result. And this is where sort of thresholds or scoring can kind of come into effect and can be really, really useful. So you can compare your data against nationally or in some cases kind of locally agreed standards. And then it splits it into sort of bands or categories, which again, it's a lot easier to interpret, because you get to see whether a result is actually within a good, bad, poor, for example. So for phosphate, standards were introduced under the Water Framework Directive, and these are site-specific and they're based on altitude and alkalinity of an individual site. And the EA use these for each site that's used for the WFD, so the Water Framework Directive classification. So they have those standards for those, and for us, we use those readings to kind of and then link it up with our nearest site rather than working out the individual standards for each specific site that we have. There is a calculation that you can use to determine that based on your altitude and alkalinity, if you did want to work that out, or if you've got kind of good working relationship with local EA colleagues, then they may be able to help you out with that in providing the data, the standards that they use for their monitoring sites. Not all parameters have kind of this national standard though, so nitrate being one. So there is no kind of ecological status for nitrogen in rivers. There is a reading for lakes and reservoirs, so between 0.75 and 1.5 milligrams per litre. But generally speaking, for fresh water, so rivers, you're looking for kind of well below 5 ppm is generally kind of an accepted level. Then for things like turbidity, again, you've kind of got ranges that have been produced there. If you've got higher turbidity, you've got cloudier water, lower turbidity, clearer. So you can kind of split it based on your readings. So the suggestion for one here is kind of below 10, 10 to 40, and above 40 or 50. And then conductivity. So again, you've got different readings depending on different conditions. So fresh water is typically between 100 and 2,000 microsiemens, whereas seawater, so yeah, salt contribution significantly increases that. And then kind of your melted snow is a lot lower. So generally, when we're interpreting our electrical conductivity data, we're looking for between 150 and 500, because that's the range that's generally considered good for ecological conditions. So we use that as a kind of baseline. Then obviously we identify any sites that are above, generally above rather than below, but above that we kind of earmark for sort of monitoring further. And then once you've kind of got these thresholds, you can then convert them into scores. So this is where you get the kind of good, fair, poor. So this again just makes it one step easier to try and interpret it. So these are just some examples that I've pulled together. So the kind of the top one, I don't know whether you can see the cursor, but the kind of the top leftish one here. So this is the kind of the scoring that's been used for phosphate, nitrate, and E. coli, and you can see that they've been split into good, fair, and poor categories, and the weightings for each are given there as well. And you'll see that there is kind of variance between, say, for example, the scoring used across these two. So the one on the right here, so a lot of similar parameters, being phosphate, nitrate. This one's got ammonia rather than E. coli in there. This one on the right is actually from the Angling Trust, so their monitoring network. That's the kind of the guidance that they give for their results interpretation. So yeah, you can see there is variance, but generally speaking, it's kind of broadly along the same lines. And then this bottom one here is the kind of thresholds for E. coli in bathing waters. You'll see again, just as a caveat, it's not a typo error there, that the good and sufficient might seem a little bit kind of out of kilter with each other, but the thresholds for the bathing water is actually done as a combination between E. coli and enterococci. So there is a difference. It just doesn't necessarily appear the way it's written here. And I'd say ultimately, when it comes to kind of scoring, the consistency is the key point. So if you're then comparing data, you want to make sure that it's all been kind of scored the same so you can fairly compare it. It doesn't necessarily matter greatly how it's split out. It might be that you decide to kind of categorize it yourself, broadly ranging on maybe the kind of national guidelines, but as long as you're consistent in how you do that, that's the main thing. So then once you've kind of determined what it is that your data is telling you, you need to decide how it is then best to kind of visualize it and how best to share that story with others. There are a multitude of different options that you can do for this, and ultimately it doesn't have to be complex. So I guess the key thing here is remembering your audience and also working to your abilities. There are, some methods that will be a lot more complex and a lot more time consuming than others. But ultimately, if you haven't got the expertise within your kind of group or yourself to do that, then there's little point in kind of necessarily aiming towards that. It needs to work for you and ultimately for your audience. So if your audience is a sort of member of the public, or if it's the local community that you're trying to relay your information across to, that'll be quite different to necessarily if you were doing it specifically targeted for, maybe just group members that have collected the data, or sort of professional bodies such as Environment Agency, or maybe even the water company. So again, remembering back to one of the best practices that I covered as well was kind of minimizing this cognitive load. The example we've got here on the left, this is from a citizen science group. So it shows all their sort of parameters together on one graph, shows their the kind of the river levels on there as well. It's really good for kind of combining it all together. but it's not so good for a member of the public or community to kind of look at that and you know, be immediately obvious as to what that's telling them. But if you're a member of that group that's collected that data, then it probably does mean a lot more to you. So again, it's having that kind of perspective. The example on the right here is a sort of visual of the eutrophication categories. And although, you know, it does require a little bit of understanding, your average member of the public or community might not know what eutrophication is, but it's certainly a lot easier for them to start to kind of interpret it, knowing by, you know, by the different colour categories, what it means. So on the eye, it's a lot easier to kind of interpret than this kind of graph form here. And again, ultimately, how you visualize something might depend on what it is you're trying to establish. So here I've just got sort of some examples that I've pulled together from the Casco project of kind of different monitoring options and outputs and questions, and how that might then be relayed in terms of what you can do with that data. So, for example, if you were looking to try and determine if a site has improved or has got worse, then a simple kind of time series with the different threshold bands on there might be sufficient. You know, that's a relatively kind of straightforward thing to produce. Whereas if your specific output was to look more at hotspots, then you might actually find more of a choropath or point map with like the traffic light categories, or ranked bar with sort of charts that kind of show you the different areas that might be more appropriate. So the example I've got in on here is one I did for again the Casco project. So it was phosphate levels that were collected on a single day, and from that we were then able to score them, and then kind of go one step further and kind of split them down into categories. So again, it was easy for us to then identify from that potential hotspots of phosphate that can then kind of go on to have further investigation work. You might be kind of looking to compare year on year or different catchments, and again, you might actually find that kind of violin plots or the dumbbell charts showing kind of before and after, or physically having the kind of percentage changes on there might be more appropriate. Or if your purpose is more looking at levels in relation to kind of agreed standards, then you're into slightly more complex realms of the kind of stacked bar charts showing the percentage that might be within those kind of different categories. And then the final one I've got on here is looking at sort of spatial pattern along a river. So that would be the kind of longitudinal profile. So you'd kind of, and I've got an example I'll show on, I think it's on the next slide, where you're showing the distance and your parameters. And you could then go kind of one step further on that to mark where you've got outfalls or tributaries joining. So you could kind of track that data across a catchment or tributary. So this is some examples that, again, just kind of pulled together. So this top left one here is the one I was just referring to. So you've kind of got your distance plot with your annual averages this is for phosphate. And then we've got the distance from the confluence along the bottom. So this being the kind of furthest upstream in that catchment or that tributary heading down to the bottom. And we've got the error bars in here. So again, kind of being completely transparent in terms of, you know, the higher and lower readings that we got. And then also we've got this red line on here is the phosphate threshold for meeting good status for that particular tributary. So we can kind of quite clearly see when we're looking at this data, you know, how the data we're collecting relates to that. The one we've got kind of top right over here, similar insofar as it is showing kind of distance down a catchment. So I believe that the kind of, this is furthest upstream, kind of moving downstream. But here it's using the kind of medium phosphate and then the nitrate levels. Again, you've kind of got your min and max values shown, and the threshold for phosphate for that particular area included in that as well. So these two kind of showing similar types of data, but obviously in quite different ways, but both still ultimately quite effective at what they're doing. The bottom one we've got here is just a simple scatter graph. So this is showing a comparison between citizen science collected phosphate data and lab tested phosphate data. So it might be that as part of what you're doing is comparing this data, so comparing two different data sets to see how relative they are to one another. And this is a really kind of clear and easy way to do that. And then the one we have got the bottom right is more of a longer time series. So I mentioned again when you were kind of determining what your kind of time frame for monitoring was. This is obviously looking at data from a lot longer time span. And it's also using both the annual averages for water quality, but also that of data from fish and invert populations as well. So you kind of get to see how the two sit side by side. So again, it's just another example for you of how that data can kind of all be combined onto one graph. You wouldn't necessarily need to do it for such a long time frame. The same principles could be applied on a lot shorter time frame. So all that I've kind of gone through so far has been relatively straightforward kind of graph creation. Obviously, there's an element of kind of understanding graph creation needed for that, but it is essentially creating standalone graphs that you could then go on to kind of add into other things. But there are a couple of slightly more like involved versions of kind of visualization that I'm just going to kind of touch upon and go through. And yeah, these can be slightly more, in some ways, effective ways of sharing that story, but they do come with a slight caveat of they generally do require a little bit more in the way of kind of time and skills in order to kind of be able to produce them. So scorecards are one of these. So they're great for kind of simple summaries, summarising a year's worth of data, providing that snapshot of river health, and they combine both the quantitative and qualitative data that might have been collected, and they ultimately can help bridge this gap between this kind of scientific element and like public understanding. They're really good if you're looking to kind of present data to catchment partnerships or for other NGOs, councils, water companies, but also these are really kind of good for members of the public and communities because they're quite easy to visually interpret. They ultimately build upon the scoring system that I discussed previously. So they combine the scores for various different parameters into one overall catchment or tributary score. And as I say, yeah, it just kind of provides this snapshot in time, essentially. And the idea is that you would do them year on year so you can track this change. Some of them also have an ability to kind of build in whether it's a kind of plus or minus, so whether it's kind of improved or degraded from the previous card that's been produced. And I mentioned again earlier, kind of providing this context. So these I like again build that into them. So where you have the kind of acronyms, but then they quite clearly explain what it is that you're monitoring, because your average member of the public might not necessarily know what phosphate is in terms of how it impacts or even the purpose of monitoring it. So you can provide that context in there, and the fact it can bring everything together as well as perhaps the more anecdotal data that you might collect. So it might be related to invasive species or wildlife that's seen, that can ultimately all be really vital data in terms of building up this picture of river health. So they provide really consistent transparent summaries across kind of several indicators. They're really good for building public awareness, and they can also help kind of prioritise areas for investigation. So if you were doing this across a whole catchment scale, you can kind of identify the areas that are perhaps scoring not so good. But even if you did it kind of smaller tributary base, you could still produce these and you'd kind of get to track that change over time. What they're not so good for is areas where you've got kind of sparse or patchy data, or where there is a requirement to kind of show raw data. So you'll notice that the two examples I've got on here, one from Wessex and one from West Country, they show the graphs, but they don't actually include the raw data. So if there is a requirement to kind of include that, these aren't so great for that. And they're also not great where you've just got a single parameter or indicator threshold. It really needs the kind of the whole kind of suite, kind of bringing it together to build up a kind of robust picture there. So the second kind of slightly more involved method of visualization is the creation of data dashboards. So these can be very comprehensive and kind of interactive ways of visualizing data. And depending how they are built, they can also sometimes automatically kind of generate time series graphs from the raw data that's inputted. In terms of an audience for these, I'd say it's kind of more primarily targeted at those that are collecting the data, so those within citizen science groups, but it could also be of use to maybe like something that if you're working with the Environment Agency or water companies, kind of sharing data so that if they can have access to it, they can kind of see it as well. You kind of need to have that kind of level of understanding of what the data is that's been inputted into there, which so it doesn't necessarily lend itself that well to members of the public. They're really good for showing real-time monitoring and for kind of visualizing this raw data without there being a lot of need for kind of formatting, and you can easily see this change over time. So I mentioned that we, for the team data, had kind of detected or been able to kind of identify the seasonal change. That was done primarily from the kind of the time frame graphs that were produced on the dashboard that we use. So there's very little kind of actual formatting of the data that we had to do to just determine those trends. So say they're good for showing the real-time monitoring and visualizing that raw data and changes over time, but they're not so good for just kind of relaying messages and sharing with general public, or for providing kind of summaries of data, like the scorecards kind of give that really good overview summary. The dashboards are not so good for that, and they do require kind of individual groups to have a kind of certain level of technical expertise, and also sometimes for kind of licenses for them to be created. So yeah, there is that kind of next kind of level of, I guess, of commitment for doing kind of something like that. So in terms of kind of some conclusions from that, so ultimately there's no sort of set way to interpret or visualize data. There's no right answer to that. There's lots of different examples out there that you can kind of pull ideas from, use as templates, and I think that's only going to increase in the future. There's no point kind of reinventing the wheel. If there's stuff out there that you can kind of take and replicate, then I'd say kind of do so. Have consideration for interpretation and visualization of data kind of right at the start of your monitoring journey. Don't try and retrospectively kind of fit it in after or decide what you're doing. Make sure that the kind of scope of your data interpretation is clear. So having the kind of the parameters there, knowing exactly what it is you're monitoring, how you're going to interpret it by time frame, the number of points that you need doing. There's no point again at the end kind of saying, well, we need 12 points, but then only having people monitoring ad hoc. You kind of need to build that in, make sure that scope's clear. Keep the audience in mind. The audience is kind of really key, particularly with the kind of visualization element. For them to be at the kind of forefront when you're doing this work. And often simple is best. So don't try and overcomplicate things. As I said, a lot of the examples I gave were relatively kind of straightforward graphs that, pretty much anybody with a bit of technical expertise could produce. And quite often they are, they're more than sufficient. You don't have to go down the route of a kind of complex scorecard or dashboard. I just thought I'd kind of cover both sides of that today. And what I've covered is by no means all of the options that you could consider. Storyboards are another one that some people look at doing. So yeah, don't try and overcomplicate it is what I would say. And I'm hoping these slides will get shared with you, because I have put the links in here to some a few different places that I thought would be kind of good points for you to look at. So one being the Casco project website. So there's lots of guidance on there around kind of more broader kind of monitoring guidance, but also within their kind of links to their data hub, where you can already see some of the kind of data that has been pulled in from various points, so Environment Agency data, existing citizen science data in particular areas. So you can kind of see different bits and pieces on there. There is also guidance on there in relation to kind of data visualization. So some of the examples of which I've included are from that site. So do take a look at that. West Country Rivers Trust, so they were one of the examples of the scorecards that I showed. They also have a really good way of, again, digitally kind of showing those scorecards on a map. So again, you can have a look there. The Anglian Trust, again, I mentioned that one of the kind of the threshold scoring systems that I showed was theirs. So they have their water quality monitoring network, and really good advice on there in terms of how to interpret the data that they collect. And then the last one on there is just the YVIS platform, which is an example of a kind of public facing dashboard that you can take a look at. So they split it down both by you can do by site, and I think they do catchment based analysis in there as well. And that's a good way. They've kind of taken the next step from it just being the kind of raw time series to doing a little bit more interpretation on that. And then any questions?